Hey Gear Seekers, I'm Nick. Today we're checking out a case that you guys have requested. Today we're checking out the Sunny Side Up Designs Meshroom S, and we're going to do exactly what you guys have asked us to do with it. We're going to build an ATX system in this small form factor case. So if you want to see this thing come together and learn a little bit about this case, make sure you stick around. And while you're here, hit the subscribe button and please double check that your notifications are turned on because YouTube's broken. SSUPD. Let's do it. Let's start off with panel removal. There's these little cutouts here that you can put your fingers in and kind of use it to pull the panels off. But I found already with playing around with this case a bit is that it's really hard to actually get in there and pull the panels off, because I'm gonna say, because this is an early sample of the case, the tolerances aren't quite the same as the retail version. Basically, all the panels are moved the same way. You can use your thumbs to push up the panels. And lastly, this side panel here, I'm gonna push from the inside and away we go. There are quite a few ways to mount radiators and fans to this case. In fact, there's just too many different types of combinations, but as you can see here on the right-hand side, you do have these brackets here to mount a radiator or some fans. I'll put all the specifications on your screen right now if you're interested. All of this can be found on the product page for this as well, because this case has been out for a couple weeks now. I figured we'll just go over a couple of these things just to kind of give you guys an idea of the differences really between this and the Meshlicious. Now, in terms of the front radiator support, we're actually seeing the same compatibility that we saw with the Meshlicious, with up to a 280mm radiator with the tubes facing down. Now, this is the recommended configuration for this case, and I would also recommend that you put your fans in exhaust to push air out the front of the case. We've done extensive testing with the Meshlicious already, and I'll put a link to our reviews in the description down below. We've tested with both air coolers and liquid coolers. Something to mention with this case as well, depending on the configuration you go with, which we'll get into in a moment, is you can actually install a fan on the top of this case, which was not the case for the Meshlicious. However, it does need to be one of those 12.5mm thick slim fans, so you can't use a regular fan up the top. This looks like a typical small form factor case. However, you can install an ATX motherboard in here, you can install an ATX power supply in here. You can't do both at the same time, although there has been reports of people being able to pull it off. I would recommend against doing that. You can also go MATX if that's your cup of tea. We will be going ATX for this build to show you how to make something like that fit. The internal layout is broken down into two modes really. So we've got the 3-slot GPU mode or the 4-slot GPU mode, depending on how thick your GPU is and the motherboard size and cooler size you're going to be using. This is currently in the default configuration, which is in 3-slot mode, and this will allow you to install obviously a 3-slot GPU with a maximum GPU length in 3-slot mode of 322mm in length. And if you're going to be going 4-slot mode, you can do 336mm in length, but make sure you take into account that you will lose some of that clearance if you decide to lower the GPU or make the GPU higher with these brackets here, much like the Meshlicious. There is an included PCIe Gen 4 riser cable here, but this riser cable can only be used if you're installing an ITX motherboard. There is an optional riser cable if you decide to go down the MATX or ATX path with the Meshroom. Because we're going to be building an ATX build in this case, I'm actually going to go ahead and remove the riser cable that comes in the case. For power supply support, the Meshroom S supports up to an ATX power supply. It also supports SFX and SFXL power supplies, and you can see that this bracket here is removable with these 3 screws to allow you to expand the compatibility depending on your layout. So typically if you're doing an ITX setup, you can quite easily do an ATX PSU, but if you're going for either the MATX or ATX route, I would suggest SFX. Power button for the Meshroom is on the back of the case here, as opposed to the top of the case that we saw on the Meshlicious. For the top panel I/O, we've got a USB Type-C port and 2 USB Type-A ports, and we have the appropriate connectors to plug into your motherboard of choice as well. Because we're not going to be going through all the specs of this case, as mentioned, we do need to make a few preparations to build an ATX system in this. So one of the first things we need to do is change the mounting for the GPU mounting at the bottom of the case. And this is actually quite simple. It's just a matter of removing the mounting bracket to actually screw the GPU in. And all we're going to do is move it to a new location. We also need to move this to the location to support the GPU as well. Now when we put the GPU in, you can see that it has a place to mount. While I'm here, I'm going to install the GPU. It's going to make it a little bit easier if I do this now rather than later. Now I've decided to go with the RTX 3060 Founders Edition, mainly because of the size, and I don't really have anything on hand at the moment to use that is a bit larger for this type of installation. The next thing I'm going to do is install the motherboard. The way you do this is through the front of the case, and it will only require 5 screws. I'll show you how this works, and something that I noticed while I was test fitting a little bit earlier as well. So loading in the motherboard is fairly straightforward. We push it in through the front of the case. It doesn't go in nicely through the side, and I wouldn't recommend doing that. So what we're going to do now is then just fasten the motherboard to the case. This is where I actually found something out that was quite interesting. If you look very, very closely, you'll see that the edge of the motherboard actually protrudes out the front of the case, which isn't ideal until you realize when you install the front panel back onto the case, it actually adds a bit of additional clearance. The motherboard does in fact sit all the way up against the front of the mesh panel there. I wanted to mention that after a little bit of fandangling with the riser cable, I actually got it to fit in the top slot anyway. And I think that's what they meant by the second slot down, is actually the location of a regular PCIe slot is usually on the second slot down. For ATX, as mentioned, I would recommend a SFX power supply. We're using one of the new Lian Li ones. This is an 850 watt, 80 plus gold power supply. Now with the riser cable installed, you need to put a bit of pressure on it to kind of bend it behind, and it's got to drop behind the panel power supplies installed. Now that all of the power is run for the system, you probably also would have noticed that I didn't install any RAM, and this was on purpose. The RAM will be the last thing I'll install on the motherboard just because of the cable clearances here, and we need to do a bit of cable management. And if the RAM was installed, it would have just got in the way. So I would also suggest you doing that last, well, almost last, if you're building with an ATX board in this case. So we need to remove this top bracket here. Yes, you can build in a different order, but from my test fitting, this was the way that I found to do this the easiest. Basically, once you've got almost everything already installed, you want to remove this top bracket here, and this basically just allows you to slide in the radiator from the top. And there we go, right? And once we get that a little bit further down, the holes for the radiator will actually line up with these holes along this edge here. For the fan orientation, from my testing that I've already done, I would recommend that you set it to exhaust. Now, once we've got the radiator installed, if you use a flat pump top like this one here, you should actually be able to feed it through the gap here. Now, also be aware that if it's not as flat as this pump top, you can remove this bracket to feed it through as well. The reason why I'm using the one that I'm using here is for the sake of it being very, very easy. Also notice I didn't put the pump top that comes with this cooler on the cooler, just so I can get nice clean tube runs down here. This just makes it a little bit easier for putting that side panel on. Now this is a case that you're not going to be looking inside of anyway because it's completely mesh, so realistically it doesn't make too much of a difference. But let's put all the panels back on and just show you how all of this actually fits in, even though a little bit hangs out. So we'll clip the front panel on, the rear panel, put that back on. Again, here's why I decided not to use the pump top cover for this cooler. And lastly, the top of the case. And how's that, ladies and gents? A small form factor, full ATX PC. It honestly doesn't have any business being this small. All right, let's take a look at the thermals for the Meshroom S in this ATX configuration with this 240ml liquid cooler. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the thermals are okay. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you are quite limited with the layout, meaning that there's almost no place to intake other than a small sliver of an intake on the back side of the case with the exhausting all of that hot air right out the side. Now, as I mentioned, if you switch that to intake, the temperatures are significantly worse and we see CPU throttling. However, in this configuration with the fan set to exhaust, we didn't see it throttle at all. And that's the meat and potatoes of the thermal testing. Okay, I'll put a PCPartPicker list down below in the description so you can peruse that list. But what about the Meshroom S? Now, there's a few things that I noticed with this case. The first thing is the power cable that you use for the power button to run to the motherboard for an ATX build isn't really that long, and they could have added, say, an extra 10 centimeters to this cable or even 5 centimeters, and it would have been much easier to route. I had to route this over the top side of the motherboard. If this was a little bit longer, I could have run it behind the motherboard, behind the cooler, and up around, so it could have been a bit cleaner. But, you know, beggars can't be choosers, right? The build quality of this case is much the same as we saw with the Meshroom, so no real surprises here. I gotta say that the fitment of the panels is a lot tighter, which makes it a lot harder to pull the panels off. I actually noticed this with some Meshroom cases that we had, so we've got a bunch of them. I feel like this is something that is really inconsistent with these cases, if I've got to be brutally honest and if I've got to be really picky. There is another ATX configuration that we could have done in this case, which actually adds an extra panel so you can do a 360mm radiator up the front, but we never got sent that, so we couldn't show you guys that type of configuration. Now, I gotta say, again, I said this with the Meshroom, having right angle connectors for plugging in cables in this case, I do not like it. I had to use a right angle DisplayPort cable that I had. I can't even use the one that came with this case. So if you're building with the ATX layout, most GPUs will have that HDMI port towards the side of the GPU, which is covered by a panel. You could use some tin snips and cut that out. And the funniest thing is, when you look at the bottom of that panel, there's no reason for that part to be there blocking it anyway. So maybe they can make a revision to that, but it is a little bit frustrating. But overall, the Meshroom S is a very, very cool case. Put it this way, guys. This is a full ATX system with liquid cooling in a case that is about 15 liters in capacity. This case is smaller than a lot of other small form factor cases in this class, but it allows a full ATX motherboard. Let me repeat that. A full ATX motherboard. There are quite a few compromises, but I think if you're going for something like this, the compromises are definitely worth it. Now, if you're interested in getting your hands on one of these cases from SSUPD, the Meshroom S is going for around $169 US at the time of filming this video, and I'll put the Aussie price on screen right now for those Aussies out there who want to grab themselves this case. And if you love small form factor cases, there's some videos right here you can watch that'll put you in the right direction for other small form factor builds that we've done here on the channel.